Okay, so let me then turn to and introduce our two guests for this evening. We're delighted to welcome Julia Gross, who is the Deputy German Ambassador here in the UK, Deputy Head of the German Embassy. Ms. Gross took up her position as a position as Deputy Head of the German Embassy in London in 2018, after spending 4 years as Head of Division for Human Resources in Berlin. And in addition to her work in the Federal Foreign Office, she's also served in a number of other overseas destinations, including the German Embassy in Tirana, and she previously also worked in the German Embassy in London, and she also spent 3 years as worked at the German Permanent Representation to the United Nations in New York, and she was Deputy Head of Mission as well for the German Embassy at Bucharest. She brings lots of diplomatic experience, both at sort of national and at international organizational level. She studied history, political science and English literature at Cologne University and at Aberdeen University, and entered the Diplomatic Academy in 1993. So Julia, a very warm welcome to you this evening. Thank you for being with us. And our other guest, I would very much like to welcome and thank Dr. Nicolai von Ondarza from the Stiftung Wissenschaft and Politik. Nicolai very kindly agreed to step in at very short notice after Dr. Helena von Bismarck unfortunately had to withdraw. Nicolai is the head of EU and European research at the Stiftung Wissenschaft and Politik. And those of you not familiar with the SWP, this is essentially the German equivalent of Chatham House. Since 2013, Nicolai has been the organizer of the British-German Outlook Group, which is a yearly exchange between SWP, Chatham House, the Auswärtiges Amt, the German Foreign Ministry, and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office here in the UK. He has a number of areas of research expertise, focusing primarily on the United Kingdom, European Union Common Security and Defence Policy, as well as broader research on EU institutions and principles of European integration. And his current research interests include Brexit, inevitably, the future of UK-EU relations. So, Nicolai, very warm welcome to you as well. Okay, I'd like to start, if I may, Julia, with a question I put to all our guests, which is not specifically on the topic this evening. It's actually particularly for our students, many of whom will probably be considering work in government or in the diplomatic service. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about how you started on your diplomatic career path, and sort of give us a sense of how you developed that.
Yeah, it wasn't a plan I had before I actually applied to the Foreign Office, I must admit. While I was studying, I dabbled briefly in journalism, and then I decided I would like to stay in university, in academia and research. And after a while doing my PhD thesis, I decided that I didn't want to do that either, and started to look around. And then the possibility of the Foreign Service came up, along with maybe applying to international organizations. I applied to several ones, and it was really only during the assessment center I did at the Foreign Office that I really decided that I wanted to do it, because I met so many interesting people during these 2 days, 2 days, yeah, assessment center. And my first post in the Foreign Office was in the press department. That was really, really interesting. And as you already mentioned, my first overseas posting was Tirana, and that was just such an interesting country to start out your diplomatic career in, that I decided to go further and stay with it. And I'm still there.
And this is your second tour in the UK in that sense. So what was it like coming back then, having done it before? Was it a very different atmosphere and environment?
It was very different. I mean, first of all, I'm doing a different job now. I mean, when I came here first, I was press attaché, and now I'm deputy head of mission, so I do different things at the embassy. And I think the atmosphere has really changed, because strangely, I mean, looking at 2 years of Brexit negotiations, I think the atmosphere has become much easier for us at the German embassy, actually, because I think there's more interest in Germany as a whole, also more of an interest in Germany's foreign policy positions. So I think we're more important now, or seen to be more important as a partner on the international stage. So there's more interest, which makes it more interesting for us.
Brilliant. And Nicolai, so a similar sort of question to you. Obviously, you're not a diplomat, but you're on the kind of sort of academic and sort of think tank pathway. Could you just sort of give us a little sense of how you started down that particular career route?
Yeah, I think my primary motivation was that I wanted to find a sort of middle ground between academia and practice. And I studied actually also in the UK in a master's program coordinated by the University of Bath. And during that program, I also saw the very vivid UK think tank landscape, which at the time was much more interesting than the German only developing, I would say, think tank landscape. And I think it was at that time that I decided to pursue a PhD, but do something much more connected to actually the practice work and try to find this sort of link between research and actual policy making. And I think this is what the SVP and other think tanks try to do. We try to work with the government, with the parties in the Bundestag and also our European partners, but still are rooted in research. And I think this is the interesting part, which makes our work so exciting, since we're kind of living in both worlds, and it's a work where you always learn new things, and this is something that I cherish.
Brilliant, thank you. And just before we get on to the substantive topic, I have one more question, because obviously the last 12 months at least we've all spent our lives on Zoom. So Julie, I'm just wondering, how has COVID impacted on the business of diplomacy? How has that kind of affected and changed the way you have to do your job in practice?
It makes many things much more difficult, because our job really is about contacts. I mean, it really is about meeting people in parliament and in government and in civil society. And also it should consist of a lot of traveling in your host country. And all this, of course, right now isn't possible. I mean, we've been on a steep learning curve in terms of technical possibilities. And I think we've now adopted all these Zoom and Skype and whatever meetings. And of course, we're also finding that this gives us possibilities we didn't have or use before, because we can have meetings with people who are very far away and wouldn't have been able to come to an embassy event. But on the whole, I think it really impacts on our kind of work, which really needs the personal exchange and the building up of trust and building working relations. So for somebody coming new to a posting, like my ambassador came in May, my ambassador came in May, and of course then it's very difficult to really establish all these close working connections. And I think also during the Brexit negotiations, we've seen that they were impacted quite a bit by people not being able to travel to and fro so freely and meeting so often as would have been desirable.
And those kind of having those conversations actually, over coffee or at the kind of in between meeting sessions. Yeah. Those are the lubricants of so much of diplomacy that's just not there now. Yeah. And Nicolai, someone who's kind of obviously observes diplomacy and foreign policy making, have you noticed a sort of a tangible difference in the way German government, for example, has operated in this last 12 months?
I think the experience is quite similar. There are new opportunities in the way that we can more easily connect with people around the world. I mean, we are now having a conversation with you in the UK. I'm here in Berlin, and half an hour ago I was at the dinner table with my kids. So that works instantly. Tomorrow I have an event with people from Greece, Scotland, Brussels together. So these are the kind of things that are possible now. But on the other hand, lots of our research also involve close personal contact, and not having been to London since last February or Brussels for me is quite a miss, especially with such a fast-moving target like UK European politics, where so much happened over the last 12 months. It's really a big loss that you can't go to people and speak with them. So just to give you an example, we have this yearly Königswinter conference, which is a meeting of German and British officials, but also academics, policymakers, and people from the economy. And this year or last year, so to speak, it worked with a Zoom meeting in London and a Zoom meeting in Berlin. And the most crucial part, the Germans meeting British, didn't really happen in practice. And I think this is what we're losing. And I'm sometimes afraid that sort of the longer this goes on, the harder it is to keep these contacts that you established. I mean, if you have really trustful contacts, you can still work with them even over these virtual formats. But the longer this goes on, I think the harder this will be. And so I hope with vaccination ramping up, we can soon have physical meetings again.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, well, let's turn then to kind of the more substantive topic for this evening. So we are reflecting primarily on Germany's EU presidency, but we're also then thinking about a number of other sort of big questions relating to German foreign policy. So Germany's recent EU presidency ran from in the second part of last year. For those of you not familiar with it, every 6 months a different member state takes the helm of the council and steers EU business. And so Germany did this at a time when there were very significant decisions to be taken. Obviously, we've mentioned Brexit. There's also then the response to the COVID and the pandemic, and also the finalising of the big 7-year multi-annual financial framework, the big 7-year budget cycle that the member states have to agree. So lots of business, lots of things that had to be agreed and transacted in the second half of last year. So Julia, if I may just to sort of begin our discussion on this, what were the main priorities for Germany's EU presidency, and to what extent do you feel, or does the government feel, that these have been achieved?
Right, I hope you can still hear and see me, because I have I'm at least audible.
We can hear you, yes, yeah.
Yeah, good. Actually, I'm very happy that we're talking about this topic, because recently my ambassador received a letter from a correspondent in Germany which opened with the sentence, "The German EU presidency is history." And I found that a bit exaggerated, because we hope that we achieved some results that will shape the EU and its future for some time to come. I mean, for an EU presidency, I think you have years, or at least months, of very intensive planning processes, and you establish priorities. And of course, we came in at a time when we had the first big wave of the pandemic, and that totally changed some of the priorities and also of the working methods in that presidency. I know also the Croatian presidency before us had been impacted by this, but it meant that we could not have physical meetings in Brussels for long months and weeks. And we also had to rearrange our priorities a little bit. And I think it's right to say that fighting the pandemic and the coordination of our countermeasures was the main challenge and the main priority. But of course, one of the other main priorities was, as you mentioned, the multi-annual financial framework, and also the big EU recovery program called Next Generation Europe. And I think at the time when we took over the presidency from the Croatian presidency, we had passed through a very difficult period for the EU, because in the fight against the pandemic, the first reactions were very much national reflexes. And by that time, I think we had come to realize that we needed a coordinated approach. But we needed a coordinated approach on that. And we really wanted to make everybody understand that we needed coordination and that we needed to make have a common approach. And that's, of course, why we chose our motto to be Together for Europe's Recovery. So we did coordinate the approach the EU took to fighting the pandemic, and we also achieved an agreement on the multi-annual framework. And we managed also to have an agreement. Sorry, managed to have an agreement on the big recovery project. I'm sorry, my ambassador is calling me. And I think what is really an achievement is that we managed to establish a link in these very difficult negotiations between the budget and rule of law criteria for the first time.
Could you just I mean, we'll hopefully have time to talk a bit more about rule of law later on, but could you just explain briefly what the rule of law issue actually is, what that's about?
Well, I think the EU really is an organization that relies on common values, and one of these values is the compliance with the rule of law and standards of democracy. And I think we agree among the EU that we want to help each other to adhere to the standards of a rule of law.
We seem to have lost Julia momentarily. Nicolai, can I just come to you then in the meantime, while hopefully Julia will come back to us. So this, can I ask you then from your side of the street, can you just tell us what, I mean, to what extent do you think Germany's EU presidency was successful? Julia's given us a series of achievements, and obviously these are significant. I mean, was it, as obviously it wasn't a clear-cut 6 months, it was a very challenging 6 months. What's your assessment of the presidency then that they've just completed?
Yeah, thank you. I hope my connection keeps up. I also lost Julia. I couldn't see her, but I hope you can see and both hear me. I think from my point of view, first it has to be said that it was quite an exceptional presidency. I think normally EU Council presidencies are really not that important anymore. Since the Treaty of Lisbon, you have the permanent EU Council President, you have the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and I like to say that presidencies nowadays are much more service providers, sort of running the EU machine behind the background and not really giving much policy impetus. But I think for Germany it was different for basically 3 reasons. The first is Angela Merkel. I mean, she is the most established leader in Europe. She has the biggest network in the European Council, and this was also sort of her final stage on the European scene. She started in 2007 with a big German EU presidency, and now this basically was her last big international moment before the election this year. And then, of course, you had COVID and all these expectations of Germany as the largest EU member state to give leadership in this very difficult time. And I would say with these high expectations, largely my impression is that Germany met them. That the success on the multi-annual financial framework and the recovery fund were really a decisive factor in European integration. I just yesterday read an article how much the decision on the recovery fund changed the perception in Italy of the EU from really critical last March, April, from being felt left alone to now really getting solidarity from the European level. So I think this was a big achievement from the German EU presidency. And I think Angela Merkel's political talents and her experience are very much, don't want to say design, but really fitted the role of a crisis manager. She always had this approach of a step-by-step going forward in European crisis, had this long experience with the Eurozone crisis, the refugee crisis, how to deal with Ukraine and Russia. And so I think these really fit her role of a crisis manager. And there, I would say the Council presidency was successful. Where I'm a little bit more doubtful is on how much it changed the long-term development of the EU. So the German Council presidency didn't touch the question on the Conference on the Future of Europe that much. And on many of the, I would say, dossiers where the German presidency wanted to have advancement on the legislative area, for instance, in the field of migration, there the achievement weren't that big. So I would say in the areas where sort of the top leadership from Angela Merkel and the good Brussels stream from Germany came together, there were really some significant successes, like the multi-annual financial framework, as I mentioned. But on the legislative area, I think a lot of plans that Germany originally had weren't fulfilled during the 6 months presidency.
That which very neatly brings me to my kind of follow-up question, and I hope I think Julia's back with us now. I hope you can hear me, Julia. So I was going to put the follow-up question was what you think Germany's longer-term ambitions and hopes for European integration are.
Well, we hope that the Conference on the Future of Europe will bring answers to these questions. And we think that it is very important to bring in the 450 million people living in the EU to participate in this discussion. Ideally, I think the majority of people should be on board with further EU cooperation and integration and deepening of integration, and we'll have to have a discussion process on that. Also, we'll have to find out whether there is an appetite, whether member states and the people in the EU will be willing to discuss treaty changes or rather not. And I think if you ask people in Germany, a great majority of Germans would say they are in favor of integration, even of deepened integration in some respects, but they will have to, they will want to see evidence where they can profit from further integration. And I think this is why we need the future of the Conference of Europe, and that is the path we want to go down to have a really broad consultation process before we decide on any further integration measures. We also think further integration should serve the goal of making the EU more capable to act on the international stage and for the benefit of its citizens, not as an end in itself.
Yeah, okay. And Nicolai, if I could sort of slightly rephrase the question, what do you think Germany's longer term ambitions for European integration should be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think really it comes down for Germany to main political decisions this year. I mean, we are in an election year, and it's in the sense the end of an era. I sometimes like to use the figure that I'm 38 and I had only 3 chancellors in my whole lifetime, Kohl, Schröder, and Merkel. So it's really a long time. And we're now at the end of the next era of Merkel, and we will have a new chancellor, very likely a new coalition this year. And the outcome of these coalition talks will really shape German European policies going forward. And therefore, I think a lot of depends on what the outcome of the next coalition will be. I think what will stand, regardless of having said that, is that Germany is firmly rooted in the European Union. There's a strategic interest to strengthen the European Union, both as a central economic power in Europe, out of Germany's economic interest in the single market, but also for foreign and security policy interest of strengthening German and European interest in the wider neighborhood. And I think the question that will be answered in these coalition talks is how much Germany will be willing to step over some of its traditional red lines together with France and Macron in the further development of the EU. And if you ask me here, as you said, what should Germany do, and you asked me personally, I think Germany has been reluctant over the course of the last 10 years to fix some of the more structural deficits in the EU, most prominent in the Eurozone and in the Schengen area. And I think it's the Eurozone where Germany needs to, in my point of view, think about what further measures to take. The recovery fund in this extraordinary emergency, I think, was a very big and important sign of solidarity, but also of Europeans acting together in the face of such a big crisis, which for me was a very important signal. And there's a debate right now in Germany whether this is only an emergency tool or should be something used going forward. In my personal opinion, this should be something built up forward to strengthen the Eurozone and really also strengthen the international coherence of the economic area of the EU.
Brilliant, thank you. Which kind of allows us to sort of segue into a sort of another big topic, and one of the buzz terms, if you like, that I've heard increasingly used in the last sort of 12, sort of 18 months or so is a concept known as European strategic autonomy. So it's this idea that Europe will somehow be more autonomous as a kind of, if you like, a collective actor, and that I think in part as a response to obviously the emergence of China as a very powerful political and economic actor in Asia, but also in response to the unpredictability of the 4 years of the Trump presidency in particular, and whether or not the United States remains as wedded to the transatlantic relationship as it has done in previous generations. Julia, your colleague Hans-Dieter Lucas, who's the German ambassador to France, he recently declared that Europe must become more sovereign. And so what I'm wondering is there a general understanding within, for example, within the Foreign Office in Berlin, what is it of what a more sovereign Europe looks like? And what is Germany's role in kind of encouraging that process? Julia, I don't know if you heard me there. I can't hear you, Julia, I'm afraid. I wonder if are you on mute? Oh, this is, no. Yeah, oh, can you?
Am I back?
You're back, yes, thank you.
Sorry, yeah, it's European sovereignty. It's a phrase it's not coined by Mr. Lucas. It's broadly used in the Foreign Office. I think also my Secretary of State has been talking about it, and I think it is a very important part of the discussion we're having about the EU's role on the international stage, because we really have to ask ourselves the question, how can we ensure that in 5 or 10 or 20 years' time, the EU and its member states will be able to play a role internationally, that they will be listened to by other big players, like the US, for instance. And how can we be a strong and valuable partner also for the US and also in complementarity with NATO? It also means, of course, how can we stand up and defend our interests in face of Chinese assertiveness or Russian increasing hostility on the world stage? And how can we make our democracy and also our model of the rule of law more resilient? And I think the COVID pandemic has really brought home again the fact that we need to be more resilient and agile in the face of crises. So we must increase our capacity to act and shape global affairs across a whole range of policy issues. It doesn't only concern defense and security policy and foreign policy. It also includes having a look at the viability of supply chains or defending our digital infrastructure against possible threats. And this concept of sovereignty serves many goals, but it also serves the goal of being making the EU a more reliable and strong partner, and also being able to assume our responsibility in a burden sharing, for instance, with the US.
Thank you. And so, Nicolai, would you agree with that? I mean, what does this more sovereign Europe look like from your perspective? Is this a good idea if we can simplify it that much?
Well, I would very much agree that it's a desired policy goal. We see the European Union and Germany being sort of having a competition in its neighborhood. We are moving towards more of a great power struggle in the international scene again between the US and China, but to some extent also with, let's say, middle powers like Russia, Turkey in the European neighborhood, where there are European interests, where it's important for European countries to work together. And therefore, I would very much agree that within the German political scene, there is a big agreement that the EU should be able to do more together. What's more contested is how much to do of that, how to deal with the new Biden administration. So how much of that has to rely and still can rely on the Americans, and how much of that needs to be done together with Washington. And then finally, how much more resources should Germany invest, where there is a big, I think, part of the contestation between the political parties, whether and to how much of an extent Germany should increase its defense budget. And so as a sort of critical observer, I would say the difficult part of the German debate is not getting a consensus that the EU and Germany should do more, but rather where and when to actually put proof behind the pudding, so to speak, in the defense budget, but also taking responsibility diplomatically in the closer European neighborhood. And it's here. We had just this morning a discussion with a colleague of mine who said that Germany, to some extent, is still very much a geo-economic and not a geostrategic actor. And I think this is a challenge for Germany to follow up with the call that many in the German political scene for Germany to take up more responsibility, to put that into a more concrete taking over of responsibility in a geostrategic and not only in a geo-economic sense.
Julia, can I just come back to you on the point that Nicolai just made about geo-economic versus geostrategic? I mean, is Germany kind of willing and able to take on more international responsibility, more leadership, if you like, or is it already doing an awful lot?
I think we're doing quite a lot. As I said, compared with the time I was at Post in London first, I think we're assuming much more responsibility now, and we also define our role differently. But of course, we know that there are expectations beyond that, not only from the US, and I think the Biden administration will not have any lesser expectations than the Trump administration had, but also from our European neighbors. And we want to assume that role. But as Nicolai said, there is a discussion on how far we want to go and in what part of activities we see our role, whether we see it also on the military field or more in civilian conflict prevention, for instance. But I think there is a growing awareness that we need to assume responsibility, and we also want to do that. At least I think that's agreement throughout the government. But there is a discussion in Germany about that, and I think we need to bring people on board and demonstrate to them why it is also in the interest of Germany as a whole and German citizens if we do our part on the international stage.
And do you think there's an appetite sort of domestically within sort of just among sort of the German population for a greater role in that regard? Do you think there's a recognition that actually it's right now for Germany to, for want of a better phrase, to step up a bit more?
On the whole, yes. I think there is a hesitancy as far as military involvement is concerned. I think we have a more of a discussion there than, for instance, in the UK. I think there is a greater willingness, and also within the French population. But I think that there is a realization that we are an economically strong actor, and then also the conclusion from that is that we have to contribute something. And of course, I think people in Germany are on the whole more comfortable with our being a great contributor, for instance, to the United Nations or in humanitarian terms or with development aid. But I think the realization is there that this isn't really enough. We need to support our partners also in the fields of defense and security.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, can I turn to kind of perhaps matters closer to home, and we think a little bit then about UK-EU relations, which subject I know that in your separate ways you're both experts in. So the new UK-EU relationship is just over a month old. We've already seen major tensions, for example, around the issue of vaccine exports, use of the so-called Article 16 in the Northern Ireland Protocol. So there are definitely tensions there, and there are issues that need to be addressed, some of which are quite urgently. But looking to the future, what would you say are the positives on which the new relationship can be built? And in thinking about Germany in particular, what are the particular areas of Anglo-German interaction and cooperation that can kind of support this rebuilding of the relationship? Julia, would you like to sort of speak to that first? Yeah,
the positives on which that relation can build. Well, for one, we now have the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and we have the Withdrawal Agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And we think that that is a very good basis to further develop our relations on both the bilateral relations and the UK-EU relations. Of course, we have to work within that framework. We think it's very important to implement all these agreements we've now achieved, but if we do that, we really have a good basis. And now that negotiations have ended, none of us have to win a debate anymore. Now that business is finished now, and we can concentrate on really reimagining our relations and cooperation. And I think there's been a lot of talk about the need for trust. And I think on the whole, there is trust, because as you see, in the Brexit negotiations, these were, I think, the most complex negotiations the EU has ever led, and it came to a good end. And I think the negotiators got to know each other very, very well, and they've worked well together. And I think we see that it is possible to have mechanisms, and that we have the people to work in these mechanisms to solve problems. And I don't think trust consists in saying that there will never be conflict again. It consists in saying we trust that we have the capability to solve these conflicts. And I think we've demonstrated that also in ongoing talks in the Joint Committee. It's being demonstrated. And even on this conflict on the vaccinations and Article 16, the idea of maybe possibly triggering Article 16, this was resolved very quickly through direct contacts. So I think there is really a basis for developing strong and very close cooperation also on foreign policy issues between the EU and the UK. Unfortunately, the UK in the negotiations on the TCA didn't want to go into negotiations on, let's say, institutional mechanisms for foreign policy and security cooperation. We would have liked that, but the UK wasn't prepared to go there. So we will have to work with informal fora. But we can do that, and we're willing and able to do that. And also on the bilateral track, we will try to establish even closer dialogue between the governments, of course, directly between the foreign ministry, but also on other levels. But we think it will be very, very important to bring in civil society actors. And we want to have a very broad outreach with a lot of stakeholders, including think tanks and parliament and institutions of education and research and youth programs as well. We think youth exchange and contacts are very important. And the issues where cooperation would be very interesting for Germany and the UK, I think they're all over the place, really. I mean, only this year we have the British G7 presidency, and I think we'll be working with Britain very, very closely on issues such as climate change, of course, also in preparation for the COP26. We have, I think, a lot of work in front of us to redefine our transatlantic relationship. I think Britain has a special position in that triangle between the EU and the US. And there are so many issues where the UK is really much closer to the EU's positions than it is to the US positions at present, for instance, on Iran and even on China, I'd say. So I think there are many, many issues where we will immediately cooperate with the UK, and where also maybe the EU will look to the UK to take some leaves out of their book. For instance, with the sanctions regime, we've seen Britain going forward with its own sanctions regime and the EU following. And I think we are always very interested to make use and to know about the British expertise in sanctions. So there's lots of areas where close cooperation will not only be desirable, but inevitable.
So, Nicolai, Giulio's mapped out a kind of quite a sort of a positive, constructive agenda there. I mean, what would you say are the potential roadblocks or hurdles to actually achieving that kind of, sort of building this new kind of positive, constructive relationship?
Yeah, I think it has to be my role to be a little bit more critical here. I think the first issue is, of course, trust. There has been a lot of trust eroded over the Brexit process, and I would say particularly over the last 6 months with the internal market bill in the UK, and the sort of signaled willingness to break its commitment in the Northern Irish Protocol. And just to give you an example, I think 2 weeks ago I attended a hearing in the Bundestag on the trade and cooperation agreement with the UK, and most of the questions of the parliamentarians were aimed at what would the EU do if the UK breaks this commitment? What would the EU do if the UK tests a level playing field? What would the EU do if the UK undercuts European standards? So there is now this impression, at least I would say in the wider political scene in Berlin, that the UK is not as trustful as a partner as it used to be, and that in some instances it's actively provoking the European Union, like for instance with the most recent decision not to acknowledge the status of the EU ambassador in London. And so I think this overcoming this lack of trust with a positive agenda would be the biggest achievement, so that we can come back to a more positive agenda. The second that has to be named is Northern Ireland. I think from my point of view, there is a co-responsibility for Northern Ireland for both sides, which we saw now with the Article 16 fiasco. I would also agree in the European Commission, but we see Northern Ireland and the rules there also being tested from the UK side with the new demands, with the trade flow not working perfectly between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland, and I think this will be a sticking point for the coming future. The optimistic case would be to come to that co-responsibility, but it could also be always a spark that reignites tensions between the UK and the rest of the European Union. And then finally, I would say there's a sort of geopolitical dilemma for Germany and the other EU states. because the UK refuses for now institutional cooperation with the EU in foreign and security affairs. EU countries such as Germany on many issues now have to choose, do they want to work in the EU forum on a foreign policy issue, or do they want to work in a flexible format with the UK at the table? And I think there will sure be decisions where it will come out in favor of flexible formats like the E3, but there will also many other areas where the EU is in the lead. And I think this will make cooperation with the UK more difficult, and I would say a more grown-up relationship from both sides would really help to overcome that, where I think this is an issue that will need to be fixed, where I hope we will come after relations are to some extent detoxified also to a situation where the UK accepts the EU also as a foreign and security policy actor, and thereby makes this cooperation more workable.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
And again, on that, and say
Yeah.
I agree on much what you just said, Nicolai, especially on the Northern Ireland issue, but that's what I said in the beginning. We have the TCA and the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, and these are the good basis for a good relationship. But that means that we have to stick to that basis and not now try to reopen or rediscuss parts of these agreements. That is the basis that we can work on, and then we can make it work. And as far as the flexible formats are concerned, there will always be a parallel track also in our bilateral relations for Germany, because membership of the European Union is part of our political identity for Germany, and it is always the key reference point. So also when we're working in a bilateral relation, we always have to be conscious how that plays back into our responsibility as an EU member and into EU policies and vice versa. So I hope we won't come into a position where we have to choose between formats, because I hope they will be able to complement each other, that we have a EU policy track where we decide in the forum of the 27, and then also discuss in parallel with Britain in these informal fora. And of course we have the E3 format, and that is going to be important in the future. It will continue to be important, and I know that the British side puts a lot of expectations into that format. I think there's also maybe a wish to broaden that format to cover more issues. But that, of course, isn't so easy anymore with now the UK not being inside the EU. So we will try to make use of that format, but we will also have to calibrate how that fits into our EU membership responsibilities.
Thank you. Okay, so my last question, which is looking to the future, and Nicolai, you've already kind of referenced this, but come the end of September this year, Germany is going to have a new chancellor. Now, I'm not going to ask either of you to sort of speculate on who you think it will be or should be, but what I'm wondering is, what would you say the key foreign policy challenges or questions are for the next German government? And should Germany's allies and partners expect significant change? And perhaps I'll come to you first, Nicolai, then give sort of Julia the last word.
Yes, I mean, first I would caution against September. Chancellor Merkel already said in her New Year's speech that she hopes this is her last time as Chancellor, giving the New Year's speech, not because she wants to stay in politics, but she knows that coalition talks in Germany can be quite long. So there might be quite some time after the election in September until we really know who the next Chancellor is going to be. But then I would say for whoever sort of now moves into the Chancellery, will really have to address some major foreign policy challenges. As I said, I think the post-Cold War order is changing significantly around Germany. We are entering a new age of global power competition between the US and China, and Germany has been clear that there cannot be equidistance for Germany and the EU between those two sides, but there needs to be a place found for the European Union and for Germany how to deal with that power competition, how Germany wants to deal with the challenges by Russia, but also to some extent Turkey in the European neighborhood. And as I said, how much Germany wants to take over together with its European partners a more geostrategic responsibility in the direct neighborhood. And I think there really will come significant choices for the next German Chancellor, also in how much to invest in European integration and how much to move forward. Angela Merkel, I would say, in her last 16 years, or at least the last 10 years, has been a very well-crafted crisis manager in the European scene, contributing to the resilience of the European Union, but also very cautious to make major steps forward in European integration. And I think this will be a question for the next German Chancellor to move forward on that. And then maybe a final point on the UK. I think there will be quite significant differences in the outcome of the German elections in terms of European policy, but I don't expect much changes in terms of how to deal with the UK, where there's a very broad consensus of German parties. And so I think the decisive outcome will be more on how to move forward with the EU as such, but less on how to work together with the UK now outside of the EU.
Brilliant. And Julia, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think regardless of what the next government will look like, I think the main challenges, as Nicolai already said, is going to be the stance to China, reshaping our transatlantic relations, but of course also still fighting the pandemic and recovery after the pandemic, and of course climate change. That's also one of the key issues, really. And I think that will be a similar mixture of challenges for any government coming in. And we are already and always seeing gradual change and adaptation of positions in the face of these challenges. And they don't only happen in Germany, they happen in dialogue with our partners and within the EU and with other partners. So I think there will be a good deal of continuity and consistency even after the change of government, especially, as Nicolai just said, in our relations with the UK.